the Hueyatlaco site. The year is 250,000 BCE. You are not in Africa. You are not anywhere near the frozen land bridge that supposedly funneled the first humans into the Americas. You are standing in central Mexico, in the shadow of a volcano, beside a reservoir that won't exist for another 250,000 years. And someone near you is shaping a stone blade. Not a crude flake knocked off a river rock. A blade. Bifacially worked, pressure flaked along both edges, balanced in the hand with the kind of precision that took generations to learn. The problem is not the blade. The problem is the date. According to every textbook ever printed, the hands holding that blade do not exist yet. In the 1960s, Mexican archaeologist Juan Armenta Camacho and American archaeologist Cynthia Irwin Williams were excavating animal bones along the banks of the Valsequillo Reservoir near Puebla, Mexico. Beneath those bones, sealed inside undisturbed sediment, they found stone tools, not rough pebbles. Sophisticated, intentionally manufactured cutting implements of a technical class comparable to Clovis culture artifacts, the tools supposedly left by the first Americans. The team called in the United States Geological Survey. The USGS dispatched a 4-person team of geologists to date the layer. That decision would end careers. What the USGS team found was not a minor discrepancy. Uranium series dating of animal bones directly associated with the tools returned a date of 245,000 years, plus or minus 40,000, published in Quaternary Research in 1981. Fission track dating of volcanic zircon crystals from the same stratum, conducted by USGS geologist C.W. Nazer, confirmed dates in the range of 370,000 years. TEFRA hydration dating of volcanic glass in the deposit agreed. Standard stratigraphic analysis by USGS geologist Harold Mauld independently confirmed the deposit's antiquity. 4 completely separate dating methods, operating on entirely different chemical and physical principles, all pointed to the same conclusion. The tools were 250,000 years old. And USGS geologist Roald Frexel, examining the tools in the field before any laboratory results were returned, declared them unquestionably in situ. They had not washed in. They had not migrated downward. They were exactly where they had been left. Lead researcher Virginia Steen McIntyre submitted the findings to Quaternary Research in 1973. The journal held the paper for 8 years before publishing it in 1981. After publication, Steen McIntyre found herself removed from the USGS contract roster. Grant funding dried up. Academic doors closed. She documented all of this in professional correspondence that still survives. She wasn't silenced through a dramatic confrontation. She was quietly starved of the resources that allow science to continue. The mainstream response to Hueyatlaco has always been methodological. Volcanic deposits can be reworked by geological activity and produce false ages. Tools can migrate downward through sediment over millennia through a process called bioturbation. The dates are simply wrong, the result of a misapplied technique or a contaminated sample. These are legitimate objections in the abstract. But Steen McIntyre had anticipated every one of them. 4 independent methods do not all produce the same incorrect answer simultaneously. Frexel's in situ determination was made in the field before any dates were known, based on direct physical examination of the surrounding matrix. You don't get 4 clocks stopping at the same moment because of a methodological error. But here is the question that the mainstream explanation never actually answers. If the layer is disturbed, which specific geological mechanism disturbed it in a way that moves sophisticated stone tools downward while leaving the surrounding stratigraphy intact and apparently undisturbed? No one has published that mechanism. What has been published is a classification. The tools were reclassified as products of a disturbed context, and the investigation stopped. The Clovis First model, the cornerstone of American paleoanthropology for 60 years, the framework around which university departments are structured and careers are built, requires that the first Americans arrived no earlier than 15,000 years ago. Hueyatlaco doesn't bend that model slightly. It breaks it completely. And the scientist who proved it found out what happens when the evidence works too well. From a reservoir in Mexico, we move beneath an ocean to a country the size of the United Kingdom that was swallowed whole and whose people we have barely begun to mourn. The antediluvian forest of Doggerland. Imagine a country, not a lost city, not a sunken temple. A country. Rolling hills laced with river valleys, oak forests breathing above wetland plains, families camped on riverbanks where salmon run thick in the shallows. Mammoth and woolly rhinoceros grazing the uplands, cooking fires sending smoke into a sky that had never seen a city. Now picture it gone. Not slowly, not over centuries of gradual flooding. Gone in days. A wall of water 25 meters high folding over everything, and then silence, and then the gray surface of what we now call the North Sea. The country's name is Doggerland. We didn't know it existed until fishermen started pulling its trees up in their nets. For over a century, North Sea trawlers working the fishing grounds between Britain and Denmark have been hauling up anomalies alongside their catch. Mammoth teeth, ancient peat, worked flint blades, occasionally human bones. For most of that time, these objects were cataloged as curiosities and set aside. It was archaeologist Brian E. Coles who gave the submerged landscape its name in 1998, and it was Vince Gaffney of the University of Birmingham who began to understand its true scale. Gaffney's Europe's Lost Frontiers project, funded at £2.5 million by the European Research Council and running from 2017 to 2022, used seismic reflection data licensed from petroleum companies, data that had been sitting in commercial servers for decades, never examined for archaeological significance, to produce the first full three-dimensional map of the submerged landscape. What it revealed was staggering. Doggerland, at its maximum extent, covered approximately 700,000 square kilometers. That is larger than the United Kingdom. It was not a flooded coastal strip. It was a continent-scale landmass with its own river systems, its own lake basins, its own ecological zones. Gaffney's team identified what appears to be a large central freshwater lake, now dubbed Dogger Lake, that would have been the geographical heart of the territory, potentially a sacred or cultural focal point for the people who lived around it for thousands of years. The landscape was temperate and forested. Pollen analysis from submerged peat deposits shows hazel, oak, and wetland species in abundance, a rich and productive environment fully capable of supporting large human populations across the entire Mesolithic period. The end came from Norway. The Storegga slide was a submarine landslide off the Norwegian continental shelf involving approximately 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment, one of the largest known submarine slides in Earth's geological record. It happened around 6,200 BCE, and it is dated with precision by tsunami sand deposits found in geological cores across Scotland, Norway, and the Faroe Islands. Modeling by Bondevik and colleagues, published in Quaternary Science Reviews in 2005, calculated the wave height along the Doggerland coast at between 20 and 25 meters. The people living on those plains would have had minutes, if that. The North Sea swallowed Doggerland, and with it, every trace of the people who had called it home for as long as 8,000 years. A Mesolithic human skull fragment dated to approximately 9,500 years ago was dredged from the Brown Bank area of the North Sea in 2009 by Dutch archaeologist Luc Amkreutz. It sat in a trawler's hull alongside fish. More than 200 worked Mesolithic flint tools and over 100 identified animal bone deposits have been cataloged from trawler catches since systematic collection began in the 1990s. These are the receipts of a civilization that left almost nothing else. The mainstream position is that Doggerland was a natural geological casualty of post-glacial sea level rise accelerated by the Storegga event. The people who lived there were mobile hunter-gatherers with no cities, no writing, no monuments. They left no durable record because pre-literate peoples generally don't. This is presented not as a tragedy, but as an unremarkable feature of the Mesolithic. Nature rises, nature recedes, people move. But that framing does something very specific. It tells us to stop looking. The seismic data Gaffney used was already in commercial servers for decades. Nobody looked at it for archaeology because nobody prioritized it. And the deeper question, whether the Storegga catastrophe, which killed tens of thousands of people across a landmass larger than the United Kingdom in a matter of days, left any trace in human memory, is one that archaeology has barely begun to ask. The flood myths of northwestern Europe, the universal deluge narratives from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas. How many of them begin on a riverbank in Doggerland, with the horizon disappearing underwater? From an ocean floor that hides an entire civilization, we travel to a South African mine, where the rock itself contains something that has no business being there. The grooved spheres of Klerksdorp. Pick up a sphere of dark metallic stone the size of a billiard ball. Turn it slowly in your hands. Running around its equator, cut with geometric precision, is a groove. Clean, deliberate, exactly centered. Now put it down and consider when it was made. Not 2,000 years ago, not 20,000. The rock formation it came out of is 2.8 billion years old. That is before complex life existed on Earth. That is before oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere. That predates the oldest known multicellular organisms by over 2 billion years. The sphere is in a museum in South Africa. You can go see it. Nobody is talking about it. For decades, miners at the Wonderstone silver mine near Ottosdal in the western Transvaal have been extracting these objects from pyrophyllite deposits, a metamorphic mineral formation dated to the Precambrian period, approximately 2.8 billion years before the present. The objects range from roughly 2.5 centimeters to 10 centimeters in diameter. Some are solid throughout. Some are hollow, containing a white spongy material that has not been conclusively identified. And some, the most anomalous specimens, have one or more precisely cut grooves running around their circumference with a consistency that no natural geological process has ever been documented to produce. The curator of the Klerksdorp Museum, Rolf Marx, has cataloged hundreds of them over the years and has described their hardness as exceptional, resistant to scratching even by steel. These objects are not soft, they are not fragile. They have survived 2.8 billion years embedded in rock, and they are still geometrically precise. The geological problem is compositional. Pyrophyllite is a soft metamorphic mineral rating roughly 3 on the Mohs hardness scale. It is not a natural host for nickel-steel alloy objects. Nickel-iron alloys in nature come from one source, meteorites. But iron meteorites arrive on Earth as irregular masses, ablated and distorted by atmospheric entry. They do not arrive as spheres with equatorial grooves. They do not arrive in parallel with hundreds of other spheres in a single geological deposit. And they do not arrive with 3 precisely spaced parallel grooves running around their circumference at equal intervals, which is exactly what the most striking Klerksdorp specimen shows. The mainstream geological explanation is that these are pyrite nodules or limonite concretions, objects that form naturally through mineral accretion around a central nucleus, a well-documented process that can occasionally produce roughly spherical shapes. The grooves, in this reading, are natural compositional banding or fracture lines that sometimes appear as ring-like features in concretionary minerals. Spherical rocks exist. Iron-rich rocks exist. Neither of these facts is disputed, but natural concretions do not achieve the nickel-steel alloy composition found in the Klerksdorp specimens, which is inconsistent with the surrounding pyrophyllite matrix. Natural banding in concretions produces irregular variable markings, not clean-centered equatorial grooves at equal spacing. And the sheer hardness of the objects is unexplained by the concretion model, which typically produces minerals of comparable or lesser hardness to the surrounding rock. The triple-grooved specimen in particular has no geological analog anywhere in the literature. No formation process for that specific configuration. 3 parallel grooves, equal spacing, precise centering, in a nickel-steel object in a Precambrian pyrophyllite deposit has ever been published. Here is what is most uncomfortable about this. These objects have been sitting in the Klerksdorp Museum for decades. They are physically accessible. Modern analytical techniques, isotopic ratio analysis, electron microprobe examination, neutron activation analysis, could characterize their composition in extraordinary detail and either confirm or rule out the concretion hypothesis definitively. That study has not been published. The objects that either confirm a completely uncharacterized natural geological process or represent the most impossible artifact in human history are sitting in a regional museum in South Africa, waiting for someone to take them seriously enough to investigate properly. What were they? We genuinely don't know. And that is precisely the answer that no institution seems interested in changing. From the oldest impossible objects on Earth, we travel forward in time to a frozen cave in Siberia, where a different kind of human left behind a tool so precise it still has no satisfying explanation. The Denisovan needle. The year is 50,000 BCE. The Altai Mountains of Siberia are locked in the cold of the last glacial period, and in a cave high above the valley floor, someone is working by firelight. They have selected a specific bone from a large bird, hollow, lightweight, strong along its axis. They have shaped it over its full 76 millimeters into a smooth, tapering cylinder, one end coming to a fine point. And then, with a tool we have not identified, they have drilled a hole through the thinnest end. A hole small enough that archaeologists 50,000 years later would need a microscope to confirm it was intentional. This is a needle, a sewing needle, the oldest one ever found. And the species that made it did not have a name until 6 years before this script was written. In 2016, archaeologist Alexander Tybankov of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Novosibirsk excavated the needle from the eastern gallery of Denisova Cave. It came from a sediment layer definitively attributed to the Denisovans, a hominin species whose existence was unknown to science until 2010, when Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published ancient DNA analysis of a finger bone and 2 molars from the same cave. Pääbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for that work. The species he identified had been living, apparently, in the mountains of Siberia for tens of thousands of years, making tools, making ornaments, and, it turns out, sewing. The needle is 76 millimeters long. It is made from the cortical bone of a bird of unidentified species selected and shaped specifically for this purpose. lightweight, strong, resistant to splitting. The eye was drilled, not punched. This distinction matters. Punching a hole through bone requires a single strike with a hard implement. Drilling requires a rotary motion, sustained pressure, a stable workpiece, and a tool harder than bone applied at a consistent angle over time. The cognitive and motor demands are completely different. Drilling implies planning, patience, and an understanding of the mechanical relationship between thread and eye that is abstract in nature. You cannot drill a needle hole by accident. You must already know what a needle is for. The same Denisovan occupation layer has yielded other objects that rewrite what we thought we knew. A bracelet fragment of chloridolite stone, polished to a mirror finish, worked with a rotary drill for its central hole. A pendant drilled from mammoth ivory. These are not survival tools. These are objects made for adornment, for identity, for meaning. The Denisovans were not scraping out an existence at the edge of cognition. They were doing what modern humans do. They were making beautiful things. What makes this genuinely difficult for the standard model of human prehistory is the timeline. Modern human behavioral complexity, what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, the capacity for symbolic thought, abstract planning, and complex manufacture, was long assumed to have emerged in Homo sapiens around 40 to 50,000 years ago, perhaps driven by a genetic mutation or a population bottleneck. But the Denisovan needle predates the arrival of modern humans in Siberia. It was made by a separate lineage that we didn't know existed. And if the Denisovans were capable of this 50,000 years ago, the question of when behavioral modernity actually began, and in how many separate hominin lineages it appeared, opens up in a way that nobody has fully reckoned with. Denisovan DNA survives in modern populations. Tibetans carry a Denisovan gene variant that helps them process oxygen at high altitude, a direct inheritance from a species we identified from a fingertip. Aboriginal Australians and Melanesian populations carry 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry. These are not traces of a primitive people who barely left a mark. These are traces of a people who shaped us, and whose full archaeological record, beyond a single cave in Siberia, we have never found. They are out there somewhere, under mountains we haven't excavated, underwater on the drowned shelves of glacial-era Asia. The needle is the only thing they left on dry land that anyone has thought to look for. From a frozen mountain cave, we travel to the equatorial jungle, where a hill that was supposed to be natural turned out to be something far older than anyone was prepared to admit. The megaliths of Gunung Padang. The year is 25,000 BCE. The last glacial maximum is at its peak. Ice sheets cover northern Europe and much of North America. Sea levels are 120 meters lower than today, and the islands we now call Indonesia are part of a continuous landmass stretching from the Asian mainland. A subcontinent as large as Europe, fertile, forested, and populated. On a volcanic hill in what will eventually become West Java, in a landscape we will one day call Sundaland, something is being built. Not a cairn, not a casual arrangement of stones, something constructed with intent, in layers, across generations. In 2023, a peer-reviewed paper published in Archaeological Prospection described what that something was. The reaction from mainstream archaeology was swift. The Indonesian government quietly halted the excavation, and the paper has been disputed loudly by people who have not drilled a single core at the site. Gunung Padang, which translates loosely as Mountain of Enlightenment, has been known to the Sundanese people as a sacred site for centuries. The visible surface is a terraced arrangement of columnar basalt, officially recognized by Indonesian authorities as a megalithic site of cultural significance and dated at the surface layer to roughly 500 CE. Geologist Danny Hillman Natawijaya of Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency suspected the structure went deeper. Beginning in 2011, his team conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys, seismic tomography, and eventually systematic core drilling at multiple points across the hill. The cores did not come back with natural volcanic rock. They came back with worked and arranged stone at depths corresponding by radiocarbon dating of associated organic material to construction phases at 14,000, 20,000, and finally 25,000 years before the present. The paper identifies 4 distinct construction phases. The surface layer dates to between 500 and 1500 CE, unremarkable, consistent with known regional culture. A second layer dates to between 3000 and 8000 BCE. A third layer reaches back to between 9500 and 14,000 BCE. And the deepest identified layer, the one that changes everything, dates to between 14,000 and 25,000 BCE. At the 25,000-year depth, ground-penetrating radar images show what appear to be enclosed chamber-like spaces with structural walls. The columnar basalt at that depth is arranged in regular patterns that Natawijaya's team argues are inconsistent with natural geological jointing. The radiocarbon dates came from 2 independent samples at the deepest level, processed at accredited laboratories. The mainstream response came quickly. Frank Levine of Sorbonne University led a critical response in Nature News, arguing that the subsurface features are consistent with natural lava tube formations, that columnar basalt arranges itself in regular patterns naturally, and that the ancient radiocarbon dates came from organic material trapped in geological cavities rather than human construction contexts. These are scientifically legitimate objections. But lava tubes do not produce right-angled chamber walls. Naturally, jointing basalt columns do not arrange themselves in alternating orientations at different depth levels, which is what the seismic data shows. And the radiocarbon dates were not taken from a single ambiguous sample at a single location. They came from multiple core points across the site, independently returning consistent ancient dates. Levine's team critiqued the paper without drilling. Natawijaya's team was in the rock. Those are not equivalent positions. What sits directly beneath this controversy is a question that the geology argument never quite addresses. If the 25,000-year layer is genuine construction, it was built during the last glacial maximum, when Sundaland was a continuous landmass, and when, according to the standard human timeline, organized large-scale construction anywhere on Earth was thousands of years away. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, currently considered the world's oldest known temple, dates to 9,600 BCE. Gunung Padang's deepest layer would predate that by 15,000 years. That is not a refinement of the timeline. That is a different story entirely. The Indonesian government suspended excavation of the deeper layers in late 2023, citing the need for further evaluation. No excavation permit for the lower strata has been issued since. The most potentially significant archaeological site on Earth is, for the moment, closed. And the continent-sized landmass that surrounded it, Sundaland, now underwater, has barely been surveyed at all. If the answer is down there, it is currently under 120 meters of the Java Sea, and nobody is rushing to look. From a submerged continent in Southeast Asia, we ascend to the high plateau of China, where iron pipes embedded in living rock have been waiting for an explanation that has never quite arrived. The Baigong pipes. There is no settlement within hundreds of kilometers. There has never been an industrial facility here. The altitude is 3,900 meters. The terrain is desolate even by the standards of the Tibetan Plateau. And running directly into the shore of a remote saltwater lake, from the walls of 3 nearby caves and embedded at multiple levels in the surrounding sandstone cliffs, are hundreds of iron pipes. Some are narrow as a finger. Some are wide enough to require 2 hands to encircle. They run in parallel arrangements. They converge directionally toward the water. The sandstone formation they are embedded in is 150,000 years old, and the standard explanation is that they are fossilized tree roots. Once you look at a photograph of them, you will find that explanation very difficult to hold on to. The pipes near Baigong Mountain in Qinghai Province, China, came to wider scientific attention in 2001 when researchers working in the region documented them and brought them to Chinese authorities. In June of 2002, China's state news agency Xinhua reported on the site, and the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources of Qinghai Province dispatched a team to collect samples for laboratory analysis. The Seismological Bureau of Qinghai sent a separate team. The results from both were anomalous enough that neither produced a clean published explanation. What the laboratory analysis found was a composition of iron oxide, silicon dioxide, and calcium oxide, a profile consistent with heavily oxidized ancient iron rather than modern contamination. The iron content of the analyzed samples was reported at approximately 30%, a ratio more consistent with smelted iron than with naturally deposited iron ore, which typically appears in vein deposits as magnetite or hematite, not as hollow cylindrical structures with consistent wall thickness. 8% of the material in the samples was reportedly described by the analyzing scientists as unidentifiable, an unusual result for geological samples that should be composed entirely of known minerals. The pipes range in diameter from under 2 centimeters to over 40 centimeters. This distribution, narrow pipes feeding into wider ones, is consistent with a hierarchical flow system. The 3 cave openings at the site each contain concentrations of pipes. The largest cave contains the most, and many of them appear to converge toward the adjacent saltwater lake, Tosan Lake, which sits at 3,900 meters elevation with no surface inlet and no conventional hydrological explanation for its water source. The mainstream geological explanation is permineralization. Ancient tree roots penetrated the sandstone sediment millions of years ago. As the organic material decayed, mineral-rich groundwater deposited iron compounds in the hollow channels left behind, gradually forming iron-rich tubes. This process is well documented in paleontology and has produced pipe-like structures in other geological contexts. But permineralized root channels do not achieve 30% iron concentration. They do not produce hollow tubes with consistent wall thickness, and they do not grow in parallel arrangements that converge directionally toward a water source. Root systems radiate outward from a central trunk in a branching pattern. They do not run in parallel arrays through cliff faces. The geometry is wrong. The chemistry is anomalous. And the question of whether any direct radiometric dating has been applied to the pipe material itself, as opposed to the surrounding sandstone, appears to have no published answer. We know the age of the rock around the pipes. Nobody seems to have definitively dated the pipes themselves. What were they? The fossilized root explanation is the most conservative option, and conservatism is generally a virtue in science. But conservative explanations still need to account for the data, and this one doesn't fully account for the composition, the geometry, or the directionality. Some researchers have suggested the pipes represent infrastructure of some kind, water management, geothermal engineering, without being able to specify who built it or when. That is an uncomfortable position, but it is not obviously less supported by the evidence than the root explanation. The lake is still there, the pipes are still there, and nobody has published the study that would settle this. From the high plateau of China, we travel to central Mexico, where 32,000 clay figurines were pulled out of the ground, and some of them were shaped like animals that died 65 million years ago. The Acambaro figurines. Picture a ceramic workshop operating sometime in the centuries before the Spanish arrived in Mexico. The artist is skilled. The figures are detailed. Some depict jaguars, some depict human figures in ceremonial dress. Some depict animals that, as far as modern science was concerned until the late 19th century, no human being had ever seen alive. A long-necked quadruped with a distinctive cranial crest, a plated creature with triangular scales running down its spine, a flying reptile with a wingspan that dwarfs the human figure beside it. The last animals matching these descriptions died 65 million years ago. Yet here they are, in clay in central Mexico, pulled from sealed earth by the thousands. The most common institutional response has been to call them fakes. The problem with that explanation is the number 32,000. In 1944, German hardware merchant and amateur archaeologist Waldemar Julsrud was riding his horse through the hills near Acambaro in the state of Guanajuato when he noticed ceramic fragments protruding from an eroded bank. Recognizing their antiquity, he hired local farmer Odilon Tinajero to excavate and paid him 1 peso per complete piece. Over the following 14 years, Tinajero and a small team extracted more than 32,000 objects from beneath sealed sedimentary layers associated with the Chupiquaro culture, a legitimate, archaeologically recognized pre-Columbian culture dated from approximately 800 BCE to 200 CE and acknowledged by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. The collection is now partially housed in the Julsrud Museum in Acambaro. Among the figures are depictions of animals that match, with varying but sometimes striking accuracy, known dinosaur genera, including sauropod-type long-necked quadrupeds, ceratopsian-type horned creatures, stegosaurid-type plated animals, and pterosaur-type flying reptiles. Thermoluminescence testing was conducted on figurine samples, with results pointing to pre-Columbian dates, though the specific laboratory results have been disputed, and authentication of individual pieces remains contested. What is harder to contest is the scale. Producing 32,000 ceramic objects, firing them to varying degrees, burying them at different depths across a site, and never being caught in the act, would constitute an industrial operation far beyond the demonstrated capacity of Tinajero working alone for a fee of 1 peso per item. In the 1950s, investigator Charles Hapgood hired independent Mexican laborers unknown to Tinajero to excavate in adjacent areas of the site. They also found figurines, including dinosaur depictions. The deposit was not confined to areas Tinajero had worked. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The figurines are modern fakes, manufactured and buried by Tinajero and possibly others, motivated by Julsrud's per-piece payment. The dinosaur figures in this view were copied from illustrations in popular science publications available in Mexico during the 20th century. American archaeologist Charles D. Peso visited the site in 1952 and declared the figurines modern on the basis that they showed no soil accumulation in their crevices, a sign, he argued, of recent manufacture. D. Peso spent less than 4 hours at the site, but here is what the fake hypothesis requires you to accept. It requires that one farmer, working alone or nearly so, produced 32,000 fired ceramic objects, many of them anatomically detailed, depicting multiple distinct animal morphologies, over 14 years without ever being caught mid-production, without leaving any evidence of a workshop, and without anyone in the local area ever coming forward to describe the operation. It requires that the dinosaur depictions were copied from early 20th century illustrations. Yet several of the figures show anatomical features, specifically soft tissue details and posture corrections, that were not reflected in popular illustration until decades after the collection was already assembled, and it requires that the most straightforward resolution to the mystery, a properly controlled, fully funded re-excavation of the site using modern methodology, has simply never been funded. Not because the question is settled, but because settling it in either direction creates problems. If the figures are confirmed as modern fakes, the story ends. If they are confirmed as genuine pre-Columbian artifacts depicting anatomically recognizable extinct creatures, the story becomes one that existing frameworks are not prepared to absorb. And sometimes, the more dangerous outcome for an institution is not the mystery, but the answer. From the central highlands of Mexico, we ascend to the Austrian Alps, where something was pulled out of ancient coal that has been sitting in a museum for 140 years, waiting for someone to explain it properly. The Salzburg Cube. The year is 1885. A foundry worker named Riedel is shoveling brown coal from a seam at the Wolfsegg mine in Upper Austria. The coal formation is tertiary in age. Laid down during the Oligocene epoch, roughly 20 to 60 million years before the present, from compressed plant matter that accumulated when the Alps were young and the climate was warmer. His shovel strikes something solid. He reaches down and pulls free a small block of dark metal. It is roughly the size of a large fist. Its four sides are flat. Its edges approach right angles. Running around its entire circumference, cutting across all four faces, is a deep, clean groove. He has never seen anything like it. Neither has anyone else. Because by every principle of geology and evolutionary biology, this object should not exist. The Wolfsegg iron, also known as the Salzburg Cube, was recognized immediately as anomalous. Riedel brought it to his employer, who understood its implications. The object was subsequently examined by Austrian naturalist Karl Gerl, who presented it to the Natural History Society of Bonn in 1886, describing its features in terms that made clear he could not attribute them to any natural process he recognized. The object was placed in museum custody, first at the Heimathaus Museum in Vöcklabruck, and later at the Oberösterreichisches Landesmuseum in Linz, where it resides today. It has been physically accessible to researchers for 140 years. It has never received a comprehensive modern metallurgical and isotopic analysis sufficient to settle the question of its origin. That absence is its own kind of statement. The object measures approximately 67 millimeters by 67 millimeters by 47 millimeters and weighs approximately 785 grams. It is composed primarily of iron, with a small percentage of nickel and traces of carbon. The circumferential groove is machined to a depth and consistency that 19th century geologists examining it could not attribute to natural crystal formation or weathering. The four flat faces approach geometric regularity in a way that no known natural process produces in an iron-bearing mineral. Metallurgical analysis conducted in the 20th century found the object to be a form of cast iron, not wrought iron, not meteoritic iron, but cast iron, implying a smelting and casting process. The mainstream geological explanation is that this is a meteorite fragment, specifically a piece of nickel-iron siderite that fell into the pre-coal vegetation layer before it compressed over millions of years. Meteorites can have smooth faces from atmospheric ablation, and the unusual features in this reading are natural fusion crust characteristics, or Wittmann-Stetten pattern boundaries misidentified as machined grooves. But iron meteorites do not have right-angle corners. Atmospheric entry ablates meteorites into irregular, rounded shapes. Widmanstätten patterns appear in the interior crystalline structure of meteorites when they are cut and acid-etched, not as exterior grooves running clean around the outside circumference. And the cast iron composition is a direct problem for the meteorite hypothesis because natural nickel-iron meteorites have a distinct crystalline structure and elemental ratios that differ from cast iron, which requires a furnace and a mold. If this object is a meteorite, it is a meteorite of a type that has no parallel in the meteorite literature. The question that should have been definitively answered by now is simple. Apply oxygen isotope ratio analysis. Apply cosmogenic isotope analysis. These tests can distinguish meteoritic material from terrestrially processed iron with high confidence, and they can constrain the age of the object's formation independent of the surrounding rock. The Wolfsegg iron has been sitting in a museum in Linz, accessible to any researcher with appropriate credentials, for 140 years. Nobody has published that study. The object that either represents the most unusual meteorite in history or the most impossible artifact ever found is still waiting, very patiently, for someone to do the work. From a mine in the Austrian Alps, we travel west to the California desert, where the greatest paleoanthropologist of the 20th century staked his reputation on a discovery that was buried after he died. The Calico Early Man Site. Louis Leakey is not a California name. He is the man who found our ancestors in the Olduvai Gorge. He is the man who proved that human evolution ran deeper and stranger than the academic world had assumed, and who spent 40 years doing it in the most difficult excavation conditions on Earth. He could read a stone tool the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. So when Leakey flew to the Mojave Desert, crouched down in the alkaline dust of the Calico Hills, and picked up a worked flint from a sediment layer 200,000 years old, and said unambiguously that it was real, the institutions that built themselves on the Clovis First model had a choice to make. They chose Leakey's death as their opportunity. Ruth D. Simpson of the San Bernardino County Museum had been excavating at the Calico Hills site since 1964, recovering what she identified as worked stone tools from ancient alluvial fan deposits. Leakey visited, recognized the tool's resemblance to Lower Paleolithic Oldowan industry from Africa, the oldest known stone tool tradition associated with Homo habilis and early Homo erectus, and committed to the project, personally supervising 5 field seasons and fundraising for the excavation until his death in 1972. The site produced over 11,000 candidate artifacts, of which the excavation team classified approximately 400 as definitively worked by human agency. Uranium series dating of calcium carbonate coatings on tools and surrounding matrix conducted by USGS geologist James Bischoff returned dates of between 135,000 and 200,000 years before the present. The site also contained a feature interpreted as a hearth, a circular stone arrangement with fire-cracked rock in a layer consistent with the tool dates. The Clovis First model holds that the first humans arrived in the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge no earlier than 13 to 15,000 years ago. Calico's dates are not a mild revision of that timeline. They are a demolition of it. If the tools are genuine, someone, possibly Homo erectus, the species that left Africa 1.8 million years ago and reached China and Indonesia by 1.6 million years ago, was in California 200,000 years before the accepted date for first human entry into the hemisphere. After Leakey's death, the Smithsonian Institution's Department of Anthropology reviewed the Calico material and issued a report classifying the tools as geofacts, rocks fractured by natural geological forces rather than human hands. Flash floods in alluvial fan deposits can fracture chert cobbles in ways that superficially resemble napping scars. This is a documented phenomenon and a legitimate methodological concern. The Smithsonian's report was produced without an independent excavation of the site, but Leakey had spent 4 decades distinguishing geofacts from tools in African alluvial deposits that are geologically comparable to the Mojave. The claim that he was systematically fooled across 5 field seasons and 11,000 specimens is not a scientific argument. It is a character assessment, and it was made posthumously by people who were not in the trench. More importantly, it is falsifiable. A comprehensive modern lithic analysis, applying controlled flaking angle measurement and high-resolution use-wear microscopy to the Calico catalog, could settle the geofact question with precision that was not available in the 1970s. D. Simpson continued excavating until her death in 2000. The site receives no significant institutional funding. The question has been closed by declaration, not by investigation. If Calico is genuine, the story of how humans populated the Earth is not the story currently taught in any university. It means Homo erectus crossed not just from Africa to Asia, but from Asia to North America, following the same instinct for expansion that had already taken it halfway around the world. There is no biological reason that journey couldn't have happened. There is only an institutional framework that can't survive it being true, and an excavation that nobody wants to fund. From the California desert, we make our final journey, back further still, to the floodplains of ancient Iraq, where the first people to build cities left behind a set of clay figurines that their own descendants apparently refuse to remember. The Ubaid lizardmen of ancient Iraq. You are standing in the oldest city on Earth. Before the Egyptians built a single stone, before the Greeks had a word for philosophy, before writing existed anywhere in the world, the people of the Ubaid period were here, on the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, laying the foundations of Eridu, building the first temples, irrigating the first fields. They are the people from whom the Sumerians descended directly. They are, in the long chain of inheritance, our ancestors too. And they left behind hundreds of clay figurines of the beings they worshipped. Not animals, not abstract symbols, not human faces, humanoid figures with the heads of lizards, elongated skulls, slit pupil eyes, scaled or textured skin, and at least 2 of them are nursing infants. No mainstream archaeologist has ever fully explained what they are, and almost none of them will discuss the question in terms that go beyond the label of ritual figure. The Ubaid culture occupied the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates from approximately 5,900 to 4,000 BCE, a span of nearly 2,000 years that predates the Sumerian civilization by over a millennium. Their sites include Eridu, widely considered the world's oldest city, as well as Tel al-Ubaid and Ur. The figurines have been excavated from the earliest occupation layers of all these sites since Leonard Woolley's landmark excavations at Ur beginning in 1922, funded jointly by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. They are held today in the British Museum, the Baghdad Museum, and the National Museum of Iraq. Their dates? Confirmed by ceramic typology and radiocarbon analysis of associated organic material from multiple independent excavation contexts, place them firmly at 5,900 to 4,000 BCE. They are approximately 8,000 years old. What makes them anomalous is not that they are strange. Ancient cultures produced strange iconography routinely. What makes them anomalous is the consistency and the silence. A systematic study of Ubaid figurines across all known collections has identified a coherent morphological pattern that holds across multiple sites and centuries. Elongated skulls with a flat occiput, strongly non-human facial structure with pronounced forward projection, eyes that are set obliquely rather than frontally, and in many specimens, a textured surface on the skin suggesting scaling. The figurines are made of a greenish terracotta, distinct from later Sumerian ceramics. The posture is consistent, arms held slightly away from the body, a posture of authority or presentation rather than supplication. And then the Sumerians built their civilization on top of the Ubaid settlements and produced one of the most richly documented pantheons in ancient history. Enlil, Inanna, Marduk, Enki, hundreds of deities with extensive visual and textual records, and none of them look like this. The lizard people simply vanish from the iconographic record, as if they were deliberately left out of the story that followed. The mainstream explanation is consistent across all relevant institutions. These are cult figures, representations of deities or semi-divine beings from a pre-literate religious tradition that did not survive into the Sumerian record. The reptilian features are ritual mask conventions, stylized animal attributes of the kind common in ancient Near Eastern art, or totem associations linking specific deities to serpent symbolism. They are called ritual figures and filed accordingly. But ritual masks in ancient iconography are depicted as masks. There is a visual grammar for showing a masked human versus an embodied non-human form, and the Ubaid figures show full-body reptilian anatomy, not a costume worn over human features. Stylized artistic convention produces variation across centuries and artists. These figures are remarkably consistent across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and hundreds of years. And the nursing figurines are the most difficult evidence to absorb into any symbolic reading. In every ancient artistic tradition, a figure nursing an infant depicts a being in a physical, biological relationship with that infant. It is one of the most intimate and specific images in human art. A deity symbolically nursing a human child is a very different image from what these figurines show, which is a reptilian mother and a reptilian infant in the universal posture of lactation. Who were the Ubaid people depicting? Some researchers have noted that the skull morphology of the figurines, elongated with a distinctive posterior flattening, matches the pattern of deliberate cranial deformation practiced by elites from Peru to Egypt to the Congo, and have asked whether the figurines depict a ruling class whose physical form was iconic enough to outlast their names. Others have noted that the Sumerians' own origin texts describe a pre-flood period during which semi-divine beings of unknown origin walked among humans, and have asked whether the Ubaid figurines are the only surviving portrait of those beings. And some, working from the simple logic that ancient peoples generally depicted what they saw, have asked a question that archaeology has not yet found a way to answer. What exactly were the founders of civilization looking at? The figurines are still in the museums. The question is still open, and most of the visitors walk past without stopping to look at the eyes. Something connects these 10 discoveries. Not a conspiracy, not a single hidden hand that suppressed them all. The pattern is more structural than that, and in some ways more troubling. Every item on this list sits at the intersection of two things: physical evidence that has been examined by credentialed scientists and found genuinely anomalous, and an institutional response that closed the question by reclassification rather than by investigation. The Hueyatlaco tools were labeled a disturbed context. The Calico tools were labeled geofacts. The Baigong pipes were labeled fossilized roots. The Klerksdorp spheres were labeled concretions. The Wolfseg iron was labeled a meteorite. The Ubaid figurines were labeled ritual objects. None of these labels are impossible. All of them are convenient. And not one of them was followed by the funded, rigorous, methodologically airtight reinvestigation that would either confirm the label or retire it. The mainstream position is not villainous. It is, in fact, the appropriate default. Science progresses by favoring the most parsimonious explanation consistent with existing evidence, and existing evidence supports a coherent and internally consistent model of human history. The anomalies on this list account for a tiny fraction of the total archaeological record. Most of the record fits the model well. Holding the model together in the face of scattered anomalies is not suppression. It is methodology. But the alternative position is also not irrational. When four independent dating methods agree, when the researcher who produced the results is professionally destroyed rather than scientifically refuted, when the objects sit in accessible museums for 140 years without receiving the analysis that would settle the question. At some point, the absence of investigation becomes its own kind of data. History has been wrong before, and not always by small margins. The people who pushed those corrections rarely had comfortable careers in the years before they were proven right. What these 10 discoveries suggest, taken together, is not necessarily that a lost civilization built everything, or that unknown beings walked the earth. What they suggest is something simpler, and in some ways stranger, that the story of human intelligence, human capability, and human presence on this planet is longer and more complex than the current framework allows, and that we have systematically chosen not to look at the evidence that would force us to reckon with that complexity. The finds are not going anywhere. The rock layers are not changing. The only thing that changes is whether we have the curiosity to keep asking. Most people walk past these objects in museum cases, read the label, and move on. You didn't. You stayed with the evidence long enough to feel the friction of it, the places where the explanation doesn't quite cover the thing it's supposed to explain. That friction is not a flaw in your thinking, it is the beginning of better questions. This channel exists for the people who won't let the friction go. Hit subscribe and make this your archive. Then go to the comments and tell me which of these 10 finds you think is the one that breaks the model beyond repair. Pick your number. Make your case. Let's see who builds the strongest argument. The oldest objects on this list were waiting in the rock for 2.8 billion years before anyone pulled them into the light. They have survived longer than our species has existed, longer than our planet had oxygen, longer than anything we have ever built will last. Whatever made them, nature working in ways we haven't characterized or hands we haven't named, was here before the story we tell about ourselves begins. The story, it turns out, has a much longer prologue. We are only now learning to read it. Subscribe, and let's keep reading together.